How did an Egyptian queen manage to cross the centuries to become the ultimate symbol of beauty and female power? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes to life, and each video immerses you in the fate of those who have shaped the world. Today, we journey back in time to discover Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, a woman whose legend has overshadowed reality. Was she really the most beautiful woman of all time, or did her charm lie elsewhere? From her formidable political intelligence to her alliances with the most powerful men of Rome, from Caesar to Mark Antony, embark on a journey through the intrigues of Alexandria, the battles for the throne, and the games of seduction that changed history. But before setting off on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and have a good journey. In the 1st century before Christ, the geopolitical scene of the Mediterranean and the Near East was marked by a multitude of kingdoms, empires, and city-states seeking to extend their influence or preserve their independence. This period is often considered pivotal, as it witnessed both the peak of certain established powers and the birth of new dynamics that would profoundly transform the balance of the ancient world. To understand the history of Ptolemaic Egypt at the dawn of Cleopatra's reign, it is necessary to examine the general context in which the main actors of this era operated, whether it be the Roman Republic in transition, the Parthian Empire, or the Hellenistic kingdoms inherited from the breakup of Alexander the Great's empire. Geopolitical, economic, and cultural rivalries were particularly concentrated in the Eastern Mediterranean, as this area was strategic for trade, control of maritime routes, and access to fertile lands. In the 1st century before Christ, Rome, whose influence had continuously grown since the Punic Wars against Carthage in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ, now extended over much of the Western Mediterranean world. In Hispania, present-day Spain, in Gaul, today's France, and the north of Africa, Roman authority was firmly established. While Italy remained the nerve center of the Roman Republic, more distant ambitions began to materialize towards the Balkans and Greece. The Senate, as well as the most ambitious Roman generals, attempted to impose their domination in the Eastern Mediterranean, where extremely wealthy and densely populated territories were located. Opposite Rome, the Parthian Empire was a major power in the East. Founded by the Arsacid dynasty, it stretched over a vast region covering present-day Iran, Mesopotamia, corresponding to modern Iraq, and sometimes extending into Central Asia. The Parthians, feared for their cavalry, maintained a rivalry with Rome that was expressed sometimes through long periods of diplomatic tension, sometimes through direct military confrontations. Control of trade routes, particularly those connecting the Near East to countries further east like India and the Silk Roads, was vital for both empires. Conflicts between Rome and the Parthians did not always reach the same intensity, but each sought to weaken the other by supporting rulers or rebellious cities in the bordering territories. Alongside these two giant blocks, there were still kingdoms inherited from the fragmentation of Alexander the Great's empire after his death in 323 before Christ. We refer to them as Hellenistic kingdoms, as they shared a Greek cultural and linguistic base while relying on sometimes very different local populations. Among these kingdoms, one can cite the Seleucid kingdom in the region of Syria and Mesopotamia, which was once a vast empire but had considerably shrunk by the 1st century before Christ. There is also Pergamum in Asia Minor, today's Western Turkey, which eventually bequeathed its territories to Rome earlier in the 2nd century before Christ. Other entities, like the Kingdom of Bithynia or that of Pontus, attempted to maintain their autonomy, even if it meant confronting Rome, as illustrated by the Mithridatic Wars of the 1st century before Christ. South of the eastern Mediterranean, Ptolemaic Egypt represents another center of Hellenistic power. Ruled by the dynasty of the Ptolemies, direct heirs of one of Alexander the Great's generals, it relies on the agricultural wealth of the Nile Valley and a commercial network linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. This kingdom, although culturally marked by Hellenism, has adopted many Egyptian traditions, particularly in the sanctity of the pharaoh. Despite a still considerable economic power, Ptolemaic Egypt is in a delicate position. Rome covets its resources and does not hesitate to intervene in its internal affairs when its interests are at stake. The Roman Republic in the 1st century before Christ is undergoing a profound phase of political transition. For several generations, its republican institutions, composed of magistrates, the Senate, and citizen assemblies, have been increasingly ill-suited to the management of a vast collection of territories. Successive conquests in Italy and then in the Mediterranean have brought immense wealth to Rome, radically altering the city's economic and social balance. The senatorial aristocracy retains considerable power, but new figures are emerging, notably among the generals, distinguishing themselves on the battlefields. This imbalance causes violent internal political struggles. The civil wars, among which one of the most famous opposes the followers of Marius to those of Sulla in the early 1st century before Christ, weaken the republic. But these conflicts also lead to the rise of strong men, capable of rallying entire legions to their cause. Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, for example, formed the first triumvirate in 60 before Christ to share influence and temporarily put an end to factional disputes. However, this pact soon breaks down, paving the way for new civil wars, whose outcomes directly influence the fate of the entire Mediterranean. In this climate of instability, Rome frequently turns towards the eastern kingdoms, seeing in them at times potential allies, at others enemies to subdue. Asia Minor is partially controlled by Rome through directly administered provinces, while mainland Greece enjoys a variable status, oscillating between provinces and autonomous cities under Roman protection. The power struggles within the Roman oligarchy sometimes give local rulers the opportunity to maneuver and obtain advantages such as tax exemptions or privileged trade agreements. At the same time, these rulers remain vulnerable to Roman military interventions, as the Republic sees itself as the legitimate arbiter in the region. Ptolemaic Egypt, due to its immense agricultural production and royal treasury, has long been coveted. The Ptolemies themselves maintain close ties with Rome, contracting loans or seeking the support of certain Roman generals to stay on the throne in case of internal dynastic wars. The debts accumulated by Egyptian rulers with the Republic gradually become a political tool used by Rome to increase its influence over the Nile Valley. The growing Roman military power is thus complemented by a financial and diplomatic strategy that allows it to subdue, or at least vassalize, still independent kingdoms. To understand the political and cultural stakes of Egypt in the 1st century. Before Christ, one must go back to the foundation of the Ptolemaic dynasty after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 before Christ. Upon the death of the famous Macedonian conqueror, his generals divided his vast empire through complex negotiations and numerous conflicts. Ptolemy, one of his companions in arms, then obtained the governance of Egypt. He took the title of Ptolemy Soter, meaning savior, and founded a lineage that would last nearly 3 centuries until the death of Cleopatra VII and the definitive Roman conquest. These rulers of Greek ancestry adopt both Hellenistic political traditions and the Egyptian pharaonic protocol, seeking to present themselves as the legitimate heirs of millennia of royalty on the Nile. From Ptolemy I, Alexandria is established as the capital, founded by Alexander the Great in 331. Before Christ, this city is designed as a crossroads of knowledge and commerce. Located to the west of the Nile Delta, it benefits from an exceptional port opening onto the Mediterranean, which quickly allows it to establish itself as a major center of trade exchanges in antiquity. Thanks to the natural protection offered by Lake Mareotis, inland and the sea on the outside, Alexandria gains a strategic position. The city develops according to a grid plan inspired by Greek urbanism, housing palaces, Greco-Egyptian temples, and especially the famous Library of Alexandria, intended to gather all known knowledge. From its beginnings, Alexandria attracts scholars, philosophers, doctors, and artists of all origins. Greek is mainly spoken there, having become the official language of administration, but many residents continue to use Demotic Egyptian and other regional languages. The first Ptolemies invest massively in the embellishment and modernization of the country, notably by developing irrigation systems, building canals, and supporting agriculture. Large quantities of wheat and other agricultural goods supply not only the local population but also external markets, making Egypt a crucial exporter for Greek, then Roman cities. The royal palace of Alexandria becomes famous for its splendor and refined court atmosphere. The Ptolemaic kings and queens host literati, patrons of science and arts, to consolidate the cultural prestige of their kingdom. However, the succession of Ptolemaic monarchs is often marked by intense family rivalries. The principle of intra-dynastic marriage, often brother-wife, sister-husband, is commonly used to legitimize continuity of power and limit external claims, but this also leads to plots, murders, and exiles. Each ruler seeks to secure the throne by sidelining competitors, if necessary, with the support of influential factions at court. These internal struggles gradually weaken the dynasty, favor foreign interference, and contribute to the deterioration of the state's finances. In the 1st century before Christ, just before Cleopatra's birth, Ptolemaic Egypt is already under increasing pressure from Rome. The royal power is maintained through delicate dealings with the Roman Republic, from which several Ptolemaic rulers contract costly loans. Roman advisors and generals sometimes meddle in succession conflicts, taking sides with one heir or another to secure financial or geopolitical guarantees. Egypt heavily pays for its status as a breadbasket and begins to lose its decision-making independence as Rome sees this kingdom as a vital reservoir for its military campaigns and the supply of cereals to Italy. Meanwhile, Egyptian society remains very diverse. Greek elites dominate the top of the administration and the army, but the local Egyptian culture persists in the countryside, around traditional temples, and among populations living off the Nile's flood cycle. Egyptian priests retain great religious prestige, making them indispensable to the Ptolemies, who aim to strengthen their legitimacy as pharaohs. This coexistence between Greek and Egyptian cultures is a distinctive feature of the Ptolemaic dynasty. There are queens dressed in Greek tunics and wearing the traditional pharaoh's headdress, official texts written in Greek and hieroglyphs, or mixed cults where the Greek pantheon stands alongside Egyptian deities. It is in 69 before Christ that Cleopatra is born, likely within the royal palace of Alexandria. Her father, Ptolemy XIII, nicknamed Auletes due to his passion for the flute, rules over a kingdom weakened by heavy debts contracted from Rome and internal turmoil. Historical sources suggest he is the legitimate son of Ptolemy IX, but the exact lineage sometimes remains debated as the dynasty is marked by obscure successions. As for Cleopatra's mother, historians lack absolute certainty. Some put forward the name of Cleopatra V, potentially wife or sister of Ptolemy XIII. Others hypothesize an unrecognized concubine. Indeed, ancient archives remain fragmentary and provide little firmly established information. Despite the uncertainty surrounding the maternal figure, we know that the royal couple will give birth to several children, among whom are Ptolemy XIII, Ptolemy XIII, Arsinoe IV, and possibly Berenice IV. Cleopatra herself is the third or fourth of this sibling group, where each child represents a stake in the complex game of succession. The atmosphere at the court under Ptolemy XIII reflects the legacy of family struggles. There is fear of certain advisors' influence, disgrace can fall at any moment, and the throne's stability is never guaranteed. Several periods of exile, crisis, and even revolt follow one another. Ptolemy XIII, sometimes driven from power, leaves Egypt for Rome, leaving his daughter Berenice to reign briefly. Upon his return, he violently removes those who usurped his throne. It is in this chaotic context, where the shadow of intrigue looms over power, that Cleopatra grows and shapes her personality. Despite the political tensions, young Cleopatra benefits from an exceptional education that reflects the Hellenistic tradition. In the continuity of her ancestors, she grows up in Alexandria, at the heart of a unique cultural milieu. The Ptolemaic princes and princesses are usually surrounded by Greek, Egyptian, and sometimes Roman tutors, so that they master each of the key knowledge areas of the time. The intellectual disciplines taught then cover a wide range: rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, botany, and even geography. The teachers require high-ranking students to also practice oratory and politics, in a world where public discourse and diplomatic negotiations are crucial to assert one's authority. Moreover, the city of Alexandria offers a multitude of resources. It is said that its library, the largest in the ancient world, houses up to several 100,000 books and scrolls. Even though it is difficult to verify the accuracy of these figures, it remains likely that access to so much knowledge, mostly written in Greek, played a fundamental role in young Cleopatra's grasp of power. She might have consulted important treatises on governance, economics, and even agricultural production, topics that would likely occupy her later when she would take the reins of Egypt. Her intellectual curiosity is often highlighted by ancient authors. Plutarch and others mention the queen's quick wit, her ability to captivate her interlocutors not only with her charm, but also with the breadth of her knowledge. One of the most remarkable aspects of Cleopatra's education is her learning of several languages. The members of the Ptolemaic dynasty typically speak Greek, the language of the administrative elite, philosophers, and diplomats throughout the Hellenistic world. However, some of her ancestors neglect to learn the Egyptian language, relying only on translations for religious ceremonies or official decrees. Cleopatra, on the other hand, is renowned for having taken a decisive step towards the native population by speaking Egyptian. This exceptional linguistic proficiency allows her to communicate directly with her subjects and to present herself as the first sovereign of her dynasty, to truly embrace the language of the people she rules over. Recognizing Egyptian culture in its linguistic dimension also strengthens the bond with subjects who are often wary of the Greek court. In addition to Greek and Egyptian, tradition reports that Cleopatra also learned Latin, the language of Rome, a rising power whose influence continues to grow in the Eastern Mediterranean. Being able to converse with Roman statesmen, read their texts, and understand their customs is a major asset in the political context of the time. Rome regularly lends money to Egypt, supports or topples rulers according to its interests, and gets involved in the kingdom's affairs through alliances and diplomatic pressures. In this sense, Cleopatra's linguistic versatility amplifies her ability to negotiate and build connections with different interlocutors, whether Greek, Roman, or Egyptian, bolstering her image as a cultured and resourceful queen. This education is not limited to theory. Like all royal figures, Cleopatra is confronted from an early age with court etiquette, the necessity of participating in religious ceremonies, and rites related to the pharaonic cult. The Ptolemies, to maintain their legitimacy, indeed adopt certain ancestral rites of pharaonic Egypt, notably the requirement for queens to present themselves as the living reincarnation of Isis, or Horus, for kings. These sacred traditions, perpetuated in the temples, help unite the population around a common cult while ensuring the rulers a divine status that is more difficult to contest. Cleopatra, well educated, learns very early to handle these symbols, which will later help her to strengthen her image both inside and outside the kingdom. Parallel to her religious and linguistic studies, Cleopatra also receives practical instruction on the political and economic issues that the monarchy must manage. Ptolemaic Egypt is then a breadbasket for many regions, and its agriculture relies on the annual flooding of the Nile, which enriches the lands. Royal finances depend on the ability to effectively tax the harvests and control maritime trade. Surrounded by advisors and stewards skilled in business, the young princess learns the mechanisms of taxation, commercial negotiations, and the subtleties of treaties made with neighboring kingdoms. Everything suggests that this education, combining theoretical knowledge and practical training, built the foundation of the future queen, who would demonstrate great diplomatic skill. In 51, before Christ, the death of Ptolemy XIII disrupts the Ptolemaic dynasty. At the head of Egypt for several decades, this controversial king had to contend with the growing power of Rome and the financial difficulties of his kingdom. His reign was marked by a series of political compromises. He incurred heavy debts to secure the support of the Roman Republic, notably to preserve his throne against internal uprisings and the threatening influence of some rivals. Towards the end of his life, Ptolemy XIII writes a will in which he designates his daughter Cleopatra, around 18 years old, and his younger son Ptolemy XIII as co-rulers. This co-regency is not unusual for the Ptolemaic dynasty, where it was common to marry a brother and sister to perpetuate the lineage. However, in practice, the distribution of power always proves delicate, as each heir relies on distinct factions within the court. Cleopatra, trained in the art of politics and aware of the importance of the Greek as well as Egyptian heritage, intends to assert her authority. From the first day of her accession, she presents herself not only as the descendant of Alexander the Great, but also as the legitimate sovereign of the two lands, Lower and Upper Egypt. This stance, which earns her the esteem of many supporters, does not, however, guarantee the stability of her throne. In a kingdom already weakened by internal quarrels, Roman influence becomes increasingly burdensome. The closest advisors of the late king ensure that Ptolemy XIII's wishes are respected, but other courtiers, looking unfavorably on the rise of an ambitious young woman, begin to plot behind the scenes. Quickly, Cleopatra understands that she will have to surround herself with loyal advisors and secure the support of Rome to consolidate her power. She also knows that the official co-regency with her younger brother carries a risk. Ptolemy XIII, if manipulated by opportunistic courtiers, could become an instrument for the faction seeking to limit the new queen's influence. Yet, at this stage, the union between sister and brother appears as an essential starting point to maintain the image of dynastic continuity that Egypt so badly needs. At the Palace of Alexandria, the atmosphere becomes tense as intrigues arise around the brand new royal tandem. While Cleopatra seeks to strengthen her legitimacy by directly addressing the Egyptian people, some influential advisors at the court ally with the camp of Ptolemy XIII, whom they deem more pliable. The young king, not yet in his 20s, finds himself under the tutelage of powerful men, ready to do anything to dominate the political scene. At the center of these machinations is Pothinos, a eunuch who wields significant influence over the royal administration. An ambitious man, he sees Cleopatra as an obstacle to his own plans, since the queen already demonstrates a natural authority and an uncommon independence of spirit. Alongside him, Achilles, the commander of the troops, forms a formidable military force whose loyalty proves crucial for anyone wishing to seize power. Finally, Theodotos, the tutor of young Ptolemy XIII, adds a veneer of intellectual influence to this coalition. These three figures, aware of Cleopatra's determination, concentrate their efforts on gradually excluding the queen. They know that Egypt, in the past, tolerated powerful queens, but is also accustomed to a man holding the primary role. To weaken Cleopatra, they spread rumors about her supposed ambition to govern alone. They insinuate that she wishes to sideline her young brother to take full control, which helps to stir up mistrust against her. Meanwhile, Cleopatra does not remain passive. Endowed with remarkable learning and a keen sense of diplomacy, she cultivates alliances with her father's former supporters. Her goal is clear: to maintain the dynasty's cohesion while showing that she possesses the strength of character necessary to govern. She also engages in discreet discussions with the Roman representatives present in Alexandria, attempting to preserve the support her father had managed to secure, albeit at the cost of hefty expenses. Nonetheless, internal pressures continue to grow. Behind the public facade of a united co-regency, the campaign to discredit the queen intensifies. She is accused of wanting to undermine the Ptolemaic tradition, of scheming to ally more closely with Rome, and even of preparing the exile of Ptolemy XIII. Every step she takes invites criticism, and the young sovereign, while resolved to prevail, finds herself increasingly isolated within the palace. Parallel to court intrigues, Cleopatra must tackle significant challenges that strain Egypt's already precarious balance. The royal finances, weighed down by debts contracted with Rome, form a major source of tension. When Ptolemy XIV sought to consolidate his alliance with the Roman Republic, he had agreed to pay enormous sums to influential politicians, drawing the required money from agricultural revenues and the flourishing trade of the Nile Valley. This strategy, though it temporarily ensured Roman protection, left Egypt in a precarious state of economic dependency. To this are added subsistence crises. If the flooding of the Nile is not sufficiently abundant, it results in poor harvests. Indeed, Egypt's prosperity relies almost entirely on these annual floods that fertilize the lands. When they prove insufficient, famine looms. During Cleopatra's initial years of reign, several regions of the country experience below expected harvests, causing shortages. The most vulnerable populations suffer, fueling protests. In this context, the queen must react quickly. She strives to keep maritime trade open, notably via the port of Alexandria, which remains a crucial hub for importing and exporting grain to other Mediterranean regions. However, foreign merchants, especially those dependent on the Roman alliance, demand political stability and a climate of trust. The tensions between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII cast doubt on the government's ability to honor its trade commitments. Internally, the queen undertakes visits to some provinces to assess the extent of the difficulties and quell potential uprisings. Ancient historians mention her strong will to appear close to the people, a strategy unusual for a Ptolemaic sovereign, often cloistered in the etiquette of Alexandria. By traveling throughout the kingdom, Cleopatra aims to establish herself as the legitimate ruler, sensitive to her subjects' sufferings. These efforts are, however, hampered by the faction of Ptolemy XIII. The opposing advisors accuse the queen of seeking to increase taxes to fund her travels and cover her debts. They describe her as a harsh sovereign, ready to extract gold from sanctuaries and local elites. Whether it's propaganda or not, concern grows, especially since Rome is closely monitoring the Egyptian situation, ready to intervene if chaos ensues. The direct confrontation between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII is not long in coming. The young king's advisors, led by Pothinus and Achilles, managed to marginalize the queen, openly accusing her of encroaching on her brother's prerogatives. Tensions become so intense that the army, part of which remains loyal to Ptolemy XIII, deploys in Alexandria to assert the dominance of the new ruling party. Feeling threatened and realizing that she can no longer count on a diplomatic resolution to these internal struggles, Cleopatra leaves the city. Some sources suggest that she heads to the eastern region of Egypt, near the borders with Syria. Others mention a brief exile in the Nile Delta area, where she may have sought to rally supporters to her cause. The reality remains unclear, as historians of the time, often biased, do not agree on the duration of this exile or its exact conditions. In any case, her goal is clear: to form an army and restore her legitimate rights. She does not shy away from the idea of relying on foreign powers if necessary. The Romans, already present in the region in the form of garrisons or legates, quickly attract Cleopatra's attention. Aware that stabilizing Egypt is crucial for Rome's commercial interests, she considers negotiating military support in exchange for favorable agreements. In Ptolemy XIII's camp, they celebrate temporarily, convinced they have neutralized a rival considered too ambitious. However, this victory proves fragile. The young king, inexperienced, remains under the control of his advisors, whose true objectives, personal power, enrichment, or influence at court, do not necessarily align with Egypt's general interests. The tensions born from the economic crisis and the threats of famine have not disappeared. On the contrary, they risk worsening if the new power cannot provide a rapid solution. Meanwhile, Cleopatra, removed from the court, sets about rallying various supporters. Her reputation as a cultured leader close to her people remains an asset in raising troops among those who reject the oppressive tutelage of Pothinus and his allies. The queen, determined to reclaim Alexandria, knows that resorting to Roman diplomacy could be decisive. In the 1st century before Christ, the Roman Republic is in turmoil. Two immense political and military figures are vying for control of Rome: Gaius Julius Caesar, better known as Julius Caesar, and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known as Pompey. This rivalry arises from a triumvirate formed a few years earlier with another general, Crassus, but the precarious balance shatters after Crassus's death in 53 before Christ and the worsening tensions between Caesar and Pompey. Both men vie for supreme power in a climate where each faction tries to rally the Senate to its cause. In 49 before Christ, Caesar, governor of Gaul, crosses the Rubicon a river marking the boundary between his province and Italy, with his troops. This act is considered a casus belli, as Roman law prohibits a general from entering Italian territory armed. Pompey, fearing Caesar's power and the popular support he enjoys, chooses to leave Rome to regroup in Greece. From there, he hopes to raise a new army and confront Caesar away from the Eternal City. The ensuing civil war is brutal. Caesar, a shrewd strategist, wins several important battles, including the one at Pharsalus in Thessaly in 48 before Christ. Defeated, Pompey flees Greece, seeking refuge in the east. He goes to Egypt, then governed by the young king Ptolemy XIII, brother and co-regent of Queen Cleopatra VII. At this precise moment, Ptolemaic Egypt is itself embroiled in internal power struggles, prompting Ptolemy XIII's advisors to ponder how to capitalize on the Roman situation. Estimating that Rome, under Caesar's influence, could more easily sign a favorable treaty if Pompey disappeared, the trusted men of the young Egyptian ruler decide to assassinate the illustrious refugee. Thus, Pompey is killed as soon as he lands in 48 BC. When Caesar arrives in Egypt shortly after, he is confronted with this crime, which he considers atrocious and politically clumsy. He publicly expresses his indignation, both for personal reasons, Pompey having once been his son-in-law, and strategic, which profoundly changes the relations between Rome and Egypt. Upon setting foot in Alexandria, the prestigious Egyptian capital, Caesar discovers a divided court. King Ptolemy XIII, still a teenager, relies on powerful advisors to maintain his political grip. His sister and co-sovereign, Cleopatra VII, has been sidelined. Caesar, as a representative of Rome and a potential arbiter of Egypt's fate, becomes the key player in the political chess game. Having his support offers legitimacy against the other camp. Cleopatra then devises a daring plan to meet Caesar. Ancient sources, notably Plutarch, report that she was secretly introduced into his quarters, perhaps wrapped in a carpet or hidden in a sleeping bag. The image has become legendary. It symbolizes the queen's ingenuity and determination to assert her rights. Although in exile or near exile, she thus manages to meet with the Roman general in person. Cleopatra's motivations are manifold. First, she counts on Caesar to help her reclaim power from Ptolemy XIII and his supporters. Second, she senses that a rapprochement with Rome is essential for the future of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Egypt, already economically indebted, cannot ignore Caesar's military power. Moreover, Cleopatra's very persona, cultured and multilingual, arouses Caesar's curiosity. She likely speaks Greek, Egyptian, and Latin, though the latter is subject to debate among historians, making her particularly able to charm, not only with her often praised beauty, but especially with her intelligence and eloquence. In these initial moments of the meeting, Cleopatra does not content herself with discussing local politics. She knows how to flatter Caesar's Roman pride while defending Egyptian sovereignty. This game of seduction and political calculation marks the beginning of an alliance that will upset the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Caesar's intervention in Egypt soon provokes an open conflict, often called the Alexandrian War. Officially, Caesar is there to restore order and, to some extent, avenge Pompey's death. Unofficially, his support for Cleopatra pits him against Ptolemy XIII and the factions that refuse any concession to the dethroned queen. 47 BC, the fighting intensifies in the streets of Alexandria and around the royal palace. Caesar's Roman troops find themselves outnumbered by the Egyptian army, but the strategy and discipline of the Roman legionaries constitute a major advantage. Nevertheless, the situation is precarious, urban, and complex. The battles in Alexandria threaten to devolve at any moment. Furthermore, Egypt is not Caesar's usual battlefield, and he must adapt to the local geography and the Ptolemaic naval forces. A dramatic event occurs during the fighting, the fire of a part of Alexandria's harbor, and according to some accounts, the famous Library of Alexandria. Although historians debate the actual extent of the damages suffered by the Great Library, this disaster remains in collective memory as an invaluable loss to ancient knowledge. Meanwhile, Cleopatra stands beside Caesar, supporting the Roman troops as much as possible with her information on the topography and organization of Egypt. Finally, the arrival of Roman reinforcements overturns the situation. Ptolemy XIII, opposed to his sister, seeks to flee but meets his end, probably drowning in the Nile, while attempting to escape the Roman army. This disappearance brings the Alexandrian War to an end and opens the way to a new political configuration in Egypt, in which Cleopatra can hope to regain the throne with the official support of Rome. The elimination of Ptolemy XIII removes the principal obstacle to Cleopatra's return to power. According to the tradition of the Ptolemies, who practice co-regency between brothers and sisters, she marries her other younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, to consolidate the dynasty's legitimacy. It is a purely political marriage, reflecting a dynastic practice aimed at preserving the lineage from Ptolemy I and maintaining the Egyptian tradition in which the sovereign and the queen govern together. However, the presence of Caesar in Egypt and his close relationship with Cleopatra bring an increasingly considerable Roman power into local affairs. The Egyptian advisors, the people of Alexandria, and even foreign observers become aware that no significant decision can be made without the approval of Rome. Cleopatra, now supported by Caesar, skillfully uses this influence to stabilize her borders, calm internal disorders, and initiate an economic reorganization necessary to address the kingdom's debt and recurrent famines. At the same time, this alliance with the Roman general represents a true turning point in the politics of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Beyond mere military protection, Cleopatra benefits from Caesar's expertise in administration. He helps her, according to some historians, modernize certain aspects of state management, notably taxation or crop control, to more effectively fill the royal coffers. Rome, in turn, profits from secure grain supplies and a strategic alliance at the crossroads between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Once the Alexandrian War is over, Caesar, now the uncontested master of Rome after his victory in the Civil War, decides to bring Cleopatra and her young brother husband, Ptolemy XIII, to his side in the Roman capital. The precise date of their arrival is debated, but it is generally estimated that they reach Rome around 46 before Christ. This journey is both a diplomatic act and a symbol of triumph. Caesar presents to the Roman population his power over Egypt and positions himself as the protector of a prestigious monarchy. The reception given to Cleopatra is, however, mixed. On one hand, the people and part of the Roman elite are fascinated by the exoticism represented by the Queen of Egypt. Her arrival sparks curiosity and admiration, as the reputation of the Alexandrian court, with its scholars, monuments, and wealth, is immense. On the other hand, several senators view Cleopatra's presence negatively. They fear the influence of this foreign sovereign on Caesar and worry about her ambitions, which could threaten the already weakened republican balance. It is also in Rome that Cleopatra presents Caesarion, officially named Ptolemy XV, whom she presents as Caesar's son. His birth would date from the year 47 before Christ, at the time when Cleopatra was consolidating her throne in Egypt. The question of the child's paternity provokes rumors and disturbs the Senate. Whether Caesar openly acknowledges having a child with Cleopatra remains subject to interpretation, but many accounts suggest that he was aware. During this stay, Cleopatra is not housed in a public palace, but in a private residence belonging to Caesar, probably located beyond the Tiber. This situation causes indignation among some Romans, as it symbolizes the privileged status of the foreign queen at the very heart of the capital. It is rumored that Caesar wished to erect a golden statue of Cleopatra in the Temple of Venus Genetrix, marking the integration of the sovereign into the mythical genealogy that Caesar likes to claim for his family. This passage to Rome also highlights the increasingly clear divergences between Caesar and certain conservatives of the Roman aristocracy. The alliance with a foreign queen, the desire to assume a quasi-monarchical power, and the cult of personality that Caesar maintains irritate the adherents of the Republican tradition. Tensions continue to grow until Caesar's assassination, which occurred on the Ides of March in 44 before Christ. At the time of Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 before Christ, Cleopatra is still in Rome, where she has been residing for several months with her young brother and co-husband Ptolemy XIV, as well as her young son Caesarion. For the Queen of Egypt, the news of Caesar's brutal death, killed during the famous Ides of March, has immediate and dramatic consequences. While Caesar, having become dictator, was a powerful protector for her, his sudden disappearance leaves Egypt in a delicate situation. Cleopatra's Roman supporters disperse, and the queen must quickly make crucial decisions to ensure her political survival. Indeed, Roman public opinion quickly turns hostile to any form of foreign influence, and the presence of an Egyptian queen in the capital has already raised harsh criticism for some time. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, seek to legitimize their act by denouncing the perceived exotic and despotic influence of Caesar, whom they accuse of tyranny. Cleopatra thus finds herself at the heart of this combustible environment, without Caesar's explicit support to protect her. Aware of the imminent danger, she hastily organizes her return to Egypt, fearing she might be targeted in the unfolding power struggles. According to ancient historians, Cleopatra leaves Rome shortly after Caesar's funeral, even as open dissensions arise between Mark Antony, one of Caesar's most loyal lieutenants, and the self-proclaimed heirs of the Roman Republic. Joined by her retinue and holding Caesarion firmly in her arms, she embarks for Alexandria with the aim of consolidating her power. Upon her arrival, she finds a kingdom that is nothing if not agitated. Caesar's disappearance, to whom Egypt owed significant diplomatic and military support, creates a dangerous gap in the precarious balance that maintained the Ptolemaic dynasty on the throne. In this context, Cleopatra realizes that she can only rely on her own maneuvering abilities to restore her authority. About 25 years old, she has already proven herself against various political challenges, notably when she had to remove her brother Ptolemy XIII to ascend the throne. But this time, the threat is more diffuse. Not only is Rome plunged into new internal conflicts, but Egypt also faces persistent economic tensions. The kingdom's coffers suffer from debts contracted with the Roman Republic, and the population endures periodic famines. Cleopatra knows she must act quickly. During this period of great instability, the first measure she takes is to assert her undivided authority within the dynasty. Her young brother, Ptolemy XIV, is little more than a teenager. He is royally ignored by Cleopatra when it comes to making strategic decisions. According to several sources, she sees him as a potential obstacle, liable to be used by possible opponents. The suspicious death of Ptolemy XIII, occurring shortly after the queen's return to Egypt, aligns with this desire to eliminate any threat of division. The exact circumstances of this death remain mysterious, but it is widely accepted that Cleopatra played a direct role. Eliminating this cumbersome heir, even though he was her brother and nominal husband, allows Cleopatra to concentrate all royal power in her hands. However, the queen is not deceived. She knows that without the Roman ally, her throne is more vulnerable than ever. The Roman generals who are fighting over Caesar's political legacy will not hesitate to intervene militarily in Egypt if the opportunity arises. That is why, freed from the presence of Ptolemy XIV, Cleopatra undertakes a series of reforms aimed at stabilizing her finances and raising loyal troops. She also banks on Caesarion's renown, her son presented as the child of Julius Caesar. To further legitimize her power, Cleopatra makes a radical decision. She proclaims Caesarion co-regent, assigning him the official title of Ptolemy XV Caesar. She thus seeks to capitalize on the popularity Caesar enjoyed in Egypt, especially in the urban and aristocratic circles of Alexandria, who saw him as a guarantor of a certain stability. Moreover, by emphasizing the relationship between Caesarion and the late Roman dictator, the queen secures a form of legitimacy in the eyes of part of the Roman elite. Even if this recognition remains very relative, it provides a solid argument for maintaining the kingdom's independence in the face of the imperialistic appetites of the competing Roman generals. At the scale of Egypt, the emphasis on Caesarion also holds religious significance. Pharaohs, since ancient times, were considered divine incarnations on earth. Associating Caesarion with a quasi-deified figure in the person of Caesar grants him additional prestige. Official ceremonies, highlighting his accession to the status of co-regent, are designed to dazzle and impress the population. Processions in temples, the issue of new coins bearing the image of the young prince, and the display of public proclamations reinforce the idea that Cleopatra and her son form the unshakable foundation of the Ptolemaic dynasty, endowed with a quasi-divine mandate to rule Egypt. The assassination of Julius Caesar plunges the Roman Republic into utter confusion. In response to this political vacuum, three men emerge and establish a regime of compromise, the Second Triumvirate. These are Octavian, Caesar's heir and adopted son, Mark Antony, one of Caesar's most loyal lieutenants, and Lepidus, a general and politician who had supported the Caesarian cause. Together, from 43 BC, these three military leaders divide the vast Roman territory among themselves to restore a semblance of order and pursue imperial objectives. In this initial distribution, Mark Antony mainly inherits the eastern provinces, including part of Asia Minor, today's Turkey, and Greece. Lepidus receives Africa, while Octavian is entrusted with Italy and several western regions. However, Lepidus quickly loses influence, gradually relegated to a secondary role. The real rivalry beginning to unfold crystallizes rather between Octavian and Mark Antony. While Rome still remains formally a republic, these three figures exert near absolute power over their respective areas. After the triumvir's victory over Caesar's assassins at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, Mark Antony wishes to consolidate his authority over the eastern part of the empire. He aims both to ensure peace in these fertile and resource-rich territories and to prepare for future military campaigns planned against the Parthians, a powerful empire that then controls much of Mesopotamia and sometimes threatens Roman borders. This period of Roman history is marked by the rapid rise of Octavian, who strives to consolidate his own power base and gain the favor of the Senate and the people in Italy. Meanwhile, Mark Antony, aware of the need to forge solid alliances in the East, turns toward Egypt. In Antony's eyes, Egypt constitutes not only a strategic partner for his campaigns, but also a supplier of considerable wealth, whether it be grain, gold, or other resources essential to Rome's expansionist policy. It is in this logic of Eastern expansion that Mark Antony summons Cleopatra to Tarsus in Cilicia, located in the southern part of Asia Minor near present-day Turkey, in 41 BC. Cleopatra, knowing the importance of presenting herself favorably, decides to travel to Tarsus in the most spectacular manner possible. Ancient accounts, although sometimes exaggerated, describe an opulent scene. The Queen of Egypt arrives on a sumptuous ship, adorned with purple sails, rowers coordinating their movements to the sound of the flute, and exotic perfumes scenting the air. She reportedly appeared herself dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, causing astonishment and marvel among the assembly there to welcome her. But behind this theatricality lies skillful diplomacy. Cleopatra seeks the support of Mark Antony, just as he seeks hers. Egypt, despite its independence, is indebted to Rome and perceived as a gem to exploit. Cleopatra knows that to maintain her throne and continue enjoying relative autonomy, she must ally with the power that dominates nearly the entire Mediterranean basin. Mark Antony, for his part, needs gold and provisions for his armies, and desires to ensure that he will not encounter hostility in the south of his eastern territories. This first meeting in Tarsus marks the beginning of an agreement based as much on political interest as on mutual seduction. According to some sources, Mark Antony organizes banquets in honor of the queen, who responds with even more luxurious celebrations, demonstrating the prosperity and sophistication of the Egyptian court. It is the starting point of a partnership that will transform into one of the most famous alliances of antiquity, blending diplomacy, love, and geostrategic stakes. After the meeting in Tarsus, Mark Antony joins Cleopatra in Egypt, where he discovers the opulence of the Ptolemaic court. Ancient accounts, notably those of Plutarch, describe an atmosphere of ongoing festivities, balls, opulent banquets, games, and spectacles of all kinds. The two protagonists allegedly founded a festive club called the inimitable Livers Syndicate, where gastronomy, refined drinks, and endless jokes intermingled. Even if these descriptions may be partly tinged with legends or propaganda, they testify to the prestige and wealth Cleopatra had to impress her Roman guest. Nonetheless, the nature of their relationship is not limited to the romantic or anecdotal domain. Mark Antony, as a shrewd politician, sees in this alliance the possibility to ensure stability in the East and prepare an offensive against the Parthians. Indeed, since Caesar's death, Rome has not abandoned the idea of avenging Crassus's defeat against the Parthian forces in 53 before Christ. Antony's legions need supplies, funds, and reinforcements, which Egypt, wealthy and relatively spared from Roman wars, is in a position to provide. Cleopatra, for her part, perceives in Mark Antony the ideal protector to guarantee Egypt's autonomy and the maintenance of her own dynasty. The relationship materializes in both a personal and political union. Cleopatra gives birth to several children from her union with Mark Antony, thus ensuring the continuity of the Ptolemaic dynasty and sealing their alliance in the eyes of the Egyptian people. Ancient authors notably mention the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, born around 40 before Christ, and another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, a few years later. This offspring serves to reinforce the queen's legitimacy as the mother of potential heirs, not only of Egypt, but also of possibly Roman territories. In the eyes of Rome, however, Antony's relationship with a foreign sovereign already elicits criticism. In the Roman mentality, the image of the Eastern queen manipulating a Roman general arouses distrust. Octavian gradually exploits the situation, aware that he could one day accuse Antonius of betraying Rome's identity and interests. But for the moment, Antony is still one of the masters of the empire, sharing power within the triumvirate, and he continues his campaign preparations. The culmination of the collaboration between Mark Antony and Cleopatra before the open rupture with Octavian comes in 34 before Christ in Alexandria. Following incomplete military campaigns against the Parthians with a mixed outcome as Antony fails to achieve a decisive victory, the Roman general seeks to show that he has nonetheless made profitable conquests. In a lavish ceremony, later dubbed the Donations of Alexandria, he decides to bestow upon Cleopatra and their children several territories located in the eastern part of the empire. Among these territories, according to ancient sources, were Phoenicia, partly corresponding to present-day Lebanon, Colli Syria, a region covering inland Syria, the eastern part of Cilicia, and even some areas of Judea and Arabia. Mark Antony also recognizes the sovereignty of Caesarion, the son Cleopatra claims to have had with Julius Caesar over Egypt and Cyprus. To Cleopatra, this proclamation confirmed the legitimacy of her son, symbolizing a dual Greco-Egyptian, but also Roman lineage. This distribution of territories, announced to the people gathered in the Gymnasium of Alexandria, takes the form of a theatrical mise en scène. Mark Antony and Cleopatra appear dressed in colorful robes and crowns, while the children receive or are promised the governance of the concerned regions. This ceremony is meant as an act of propaganda, aiming to bolster the image of a powerful Greco-Egyptian bloc ready to shine over the entire Eastern Mediterranean. However, from the Roman perspective, these donations of Alexandria are seen as a betrayal. Many senators perceive it as Marcus Antonius's attempt to fracture the empire by offering lands subject or allied to Rome to a foreign sovereign. Worse, they suspect Cleopatra of wanting to establish a form of independent empire that would escape the control of the Italian capital. Octavian, who continually strengthens his position in Italy and presents himself as the defender of Roman traditions, seizes this opportunity to launch a violent public campaign against Mark Antony. In the final years of the 1st century before Christ, the rivalry between Mark Antony and Octavian, both political heirs of Julius Caesar, only continues to grow. Octavian, presenting himself as the defender of traditional Roman values, seeks to consolidate his power against a Mark Antony, whose alliance with Cleopatra raises many criticisms in Rome. To the Roman public opinion of the time, Cleopatra initially appears only as a distant Eastern sovereign. However, contemporary historians emphasize the active role Octavian plays in transforming this relatively neutral image into a potential threat, targeting the very heart of Roman identity. He accuses Cleopatra of wanting to impose a foreign monarchical power on the Republic, which, for many senators and citizens, remains a latent nightmare since the end of the monarchy in Rome, several centuries earlier. To reinforce this propaganda, Octavian skillfully uses the relationship between Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Roman sources opposed to Mark Antony describe their romantic link as a betrayal of the Roman spirit. According to these accounts, the Queen of Egypt had bewitched Mark Antony with her beauty and cunning, prompting him to turn his back on his homeland and endanger the entire Roman world for the benefit of a foreign power. The idea that the couple intends to establish an autonomous Eastern empire, even to rival Rome, fuels fears. In the Senate, Octavian spreads information, true or exaggerated, about the reforms undertaken jointly by Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the territories under their control. He notably highlights that Mark Antony redistributes lands to Cleopatra and her children, disregarding the institutions of the Republic, and presents this situation as an obvious sign of the growing domination of the Queen over her Roman ally. In Roman mentalities, nourished by models of virtue, this supposed feminine domination reinforces the idea that Mark Antony is nothing more than the instrument of an Eastern queen, synonymous with decadent luxury and a danger to Rome's moral values. Through public speeches, political accusations, and solemn declarations, Octavian manages to instill a climate of fear. The supporters of Mark Antony in Italy find themselves increasingly isolated, and many Romans begin to see Cleopatra as a direct threat. This propaganda campaign, undoubtedly one of the most effective of the time, proves decisive. It psychologically and politically prepares the ground for a military confrontation that becomes, according to Octavian, as necessary as it is legitimate for the defense of Rome and its traditions. In 32, before Christ, as discord sows confusion within the Roman world, it becomes clear to observers of the time that war between Octavian and the couple formed by Mark Antony and Cleopatra is almost inevitable. Both camps are busy mobilizing their forces and supports. Octavian, still officially allied with Mark Antony under the Second Triumvirate, no longer hides his intention to crush his rival. He embarks on a series of diplomatic campaigns aimed at rallying the western provinces of the Roman Empire, such as Gaul or Hispania, to his cause. On the other hand, Mark Antony, stationed in the east, takes advantage of regional riches to build a solid army and an impressive war fleet. Egypt, led by Cleopatra, provides him with significant financial and material resources. Naval shipyards operate at full capacity along the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean, while troops are recruited or raised among Mark Antony's allied kingdoms. He also attempts to strengthen his influence in Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, Syria, and Cilicia, to secure his supplies of food and weaponry. Mark Antony and Cleopatra, on a purely strategic level, rely on a direct confrontation in the eastern Mediterranean region. They both possess notable military experience. Mark Antony is one of Julius Caesar's closest former lieutenants, having already commanded legions in several campaigns. Cleopatra, on the other hand, is not a warrior in the Roman sense of the term, but she knows how to handle politics and has a comprehensive understanding of the field, mobilizing all Egyptian resources to support the war effort. Octavian, supported by the Senate, must maneuver cautiously. He knows that Mark Antony enjoys solid recognition among certain legions due to his Caesarian heritage. Veteran officers remain divided, but many gradually rally to Octavian, who continues to promote his status as Caesar's adoptive son, while promising land and benefits to his soldiers. Admiral Agrippa, a close friend and talented general, takes charge of the construction and modernization of Octavian's fleet. His role will be decisive. In Rome, Octavian requisitions funds and calls upon the notables to support the military effort. He presents himself as the guarantor of order, ready to defend the Republic against the Eastern threat embodied by Cleopatra. This rhetoric, already hammered out at the propaganda stage, is then realized in the call to arms. Naval operations become crucial as the Mediterranean plays a vital role as a commercial and military corridor. Both camps understand that a victory at sea would severely hinder the opponent's supply line and could force a rapid capitulation. The clash between the two forces occurs in 31 before Christ, off the promontory of Actium in western Greece. Actium, a strategic position located near the Gulf of Ambracia, occupies a central place in the planning of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, who station their troops and fleet there to counter Octavian's maneuvers. Octavian, aware that the naval confrontation could seal the outcome of the conflict, entrusts the command of maritime operations to his loyal lieutenant, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Agrippa is already recognized as one of the best strategists of his time. He has modernized the Octavian navy, constructed more maneuverable ships, and trained experienced rowers. His fleet consists of medium-sized, well-equipped ships that can sail agilely even in weak winds. Mark Antony, for his part, aligns heavier galleys, often armed and reinforced with massive rams, which can be a formidable asset in close combat, but are less practical under variable wind conditions. In the days leading up to the battle, the balance of forces remains uncertain. Mark Antony, who has battle-hardened legions and an imposing fleet, has nevertheless suffered some defections. Some war chiefs do not wish to engage their troops in a direct confrontation, finding the political situation uncomfortable. Supply difficulties also weigh on the morale of his soldiers. In contrast, Octavian benefits from more homogeneous support and better logistics. The Battle of Actium takes place on September 2nd, 31st before Christ. Under a scorching sun and facing a capricious sea, the ships of both camps engage in a decisive confrontation. Agrippa seeks to gradually encircle Mark Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, leveraging the superior mobility of his vessels. Mark Antony, on his side, wants to force a frontal collision to take advantage of his large ship's robustness. However, the situation quickly turns in Agrippa's favor. The Octavian ships, faster, manage to harass the enemy before retreating, making the close quarters tactic anticipated by Mark Antony impossible. As confusion sets in, Cleopatra, stationed on her royal ship, evaluates the battle as too risky. According to some ancient accounts, she decides to leave the battlefield to preserve her fleet and protect her treasures, perhaps hoping to reorganize Egyptian forces elsewhere. Mark Antony interprets this maneuver as a definitive withdrawal, even an abandonment. Caught off guard and fearing for the queen's safety, he chooses to break off the battle to join her. This gesture causes the moral disintegration of his troops, who find themselves leaderless and gradually lose ground. At sea, Agrippa takes advantage of this moment of uncertainty to secure a decisive victory. On land, the legions, torn between loyalty and opportunism, disperse or switch allegiance to Octavian upon learning the news. The Battle of Actium thus ends in the rout of Mark Antony's fleet. This naval engagement, one of the most significant of antiquity, almost seals the outcome of the Roman Civil War. The military reputation of the couple, formed by Mark Antony and Cleopatra, suffers a fatal blow, while Octavian appears more than ever as the future master of the entire Roman world. After the disaster at Actium, the consequences for Mark Antony and Cleopatra are immediate and significant. Having escaped total destruction, they retreat to Alexandria, the Egyptian capital, where their entire court has taken refuge. On site, Mark Antony tries to reorganize his troops, but many experienced soldiers and officers have already defected or been captured by Octavian. The morale of the survivors is low, and the prospect of reconquest diminishes day by day. Egypt, once independent thanks to its immense fortune and Cleopatra's skillful diplomacy, now finds itself encircled by Octavian's forces. Having been victorious at Actium, Octavian enjoys new momentum, both militarily and politically. He has the support of the Senate and the provinces, and he can present himself as the restorer of peace after a decade of civil conflicts. In the months that follow, Octavian conducts a systematic campaign of reclaiming territories that had fallen under Mark Antony's authority. The small kingdoms allied to the defeated triumvir switched sides to secure the victor's favor. The eastern kingdoms, once under Cleopatra's influence, begin to detach from Egypt due to a lack of solid protection and federation. The trade and maritime routes are gradually controlled by Octavian's admirals, suffocating Alexandria's supplies. Aware that naval and land supremacy now rests with Octavian, Mark Antony sees his range of action narrowing. Cleopatra's once considerable monetary resources are now used to keep the Egyptian troops alert and to strengthen Alexandria's defenses. Despite her political ingenuity, the queen can no longer rely on surprise effects or the support of external provinces. On the diplomatic front, vain attempts are made to negotiate with Octavian. Mark Antony proposes, according to some sources, to renounce all his political claims in exchange for the recognition of Cleopatra's sovereign status. Octavian, however, desires nothing less than total surrender and definitive control of Egypt. He indeed harbors a global project to reign without share and establish his authority over the entire old realm of Caesar, which involves eliminating any threat, including Cleopatra. Facing this existential threat, Cleopatra reorganizes logistics in the city, storing supplies and preparing evacuation plans for her close ones. According to some sources, she even had a fortified area set up within Alexandria to protect her treasures and have the possibility of resisting in an ultimate refuge if the city were to fall. Mark Antony, on his end, tries to recruit new troops among the local garrisons and scattered mercenaries in the east. He hopes to regain the trust of some allied leaders, but most have already rallied to Octavian, judging his victory inevitable. Meanwhile, the Alexandrian population suffers from the growing tension. The long years of war, combined with the losses in the Mediterranean, have generated palpable anxiety in the city. Cleopatra, aware of the importance of maintaining a semblance of calm, organizes food distributions for the most impoverished and tries to preserve the city's usual dynamism. But as Octavian's legions approach Alexandria, the noose tightens. The arrival of Roman forces near the city in the summer of 30 before Christ marks the beginning of a true siege. The defensive tactics devised by Cleopatra and Mark Antony involved fortifying certain entry points likely to slow the enemy while relying on their knowledge of the terrain. However, the military might of Rome, combined with the defection of several regiments once loyal, made the task nearly impossible. Octavian, cautious, avoided an immediate frontal assault and preferred to isolate the capital to force Mark Antony and Cleopatra to surrender. Informal negotiations were probably attempted by Octavian's entourage to have Alexandria capitulate without bloodshed, but the queen and her lover refused to yield. Very quickly, the land and naval blockade began to strangle the defenses. Cut off from external supply sources, the city couldn't hold out for long. Learning that the situation was desperate, Mark Antony prepared for the worst. Tensions rose, the fervor of the troops waned, and the outcome seemed beyond doubt. The gates of Alexandria were on the verge of giving way, heralding the imminent end of the Ptolemaic dynasty. When Octavian's legions finally reached Alexandria, Mark Antony made one last sortie to loosen the noose. He gathered what remained of his army, and in a final surge, attempted to engage in combat. Unfortunately for him, most of his soldiers had lost hope of victory. Some surrendered to the enemy, others deserted. Octavian, well aware of Mark Antony's psychological state, exploited every weakness to encourage the surrender of opposing commanders. Faced with this widespread collapse, Mark Antony was plunged into deep despair. Ancient accounts speak of a man immensely exhausted by successive defeats and the prospect of losing not only his honor but also his life and Cleopatra's. According to some chroniclers, he contemplated negotiating with Octavian, offering to sacrifice himself to spare the queen and save Egypt's future. However, Octavian, more interested in the complete elimination of his opponents and the seizure of Egypt's wealth, reportedly did not entertain these pleas. It was then that a decisive rumor reached Mark Antony. Cleopatra was dead. The origins of this information remain mysterious. Some historians believe the rumor was born from a misunderstanding or a deliberate strategy by the queen, who feigned her death to gauge Mark Antony's reaction and attempt a final diplomatic maneuver. Regardless, this news dealt a fatal blow to Mark Antony. The general, stricken at the thought of having lost the woman he loved and supported against all odds, decided to take his own life. The accounts differ regarding the exact circumstances of his suicide. One of the most widespread, reported by the historian Plutarch, says that Mark Antony stabbed himself with his sword in the manner of a Roman officer trapped by failure. Severely injured, he reportedly remained alive long enough to learn that Cleopatra was not actually dead. At the queen's request, servants then brought him to her, where he expired in her arms. Other less-known accounts mention a more brutal death, without this melodramatic aspect. However, the different sources agree on one point. It was despair, fueled by the rumor of Cleopatra's death, that precipitated his end. After Mark Antony's death, Cleopatra found herself isolated in her palace. Octavian, aware of his imminent triumph, now sought to capture the queen alive to present her in Rome as a war trophy. The stakes were twofold: confirm his authority in the eyes of the Roman people and celebrate the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a symbol of an Egypt hitherto independent. For Cleopatra, who had always shrewdly negotiated her power, being humiliated in a triumphal parade where she would be displayed in chains was out of the question. The sovereign, renowned for her determination and intelligence, therefore organized her final negotiations. She attempted to win over Octavian with diplomacy, hoping to obtain an arrangement that would preserve her children's freedom. As a token of good faith, she might have sent treasures or letters detailing various political arguments. However, Octavian remained inflexible. His main goal was to bring Cleopatra back captive to Rome to present her during his triumph. Convinced that no negotiation is possible and refusing to suffer public humiliation, Cleopatra then chooses death. The accounts of how she ends her life are shrouded in mystery and legend. The most famous of these involves the intervention of an asp, a venomous snake, introduced into the queen's chamber. hidden in a basket of figs or concealed in a hamper. Other ancient texts suggest rather a poison applied with a pin or a deadly ointment. In any case, the central idea remains the same. Cleopatra is said to have deliberately used a toxic means to take her own life, categorically refusing to fall alive into the hands of her enemy. Her death, which occurred in August 30th before Christ, holds immense importance for the history of Egypt. It marks the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from the successors of Alexander the Great, who had been seated on the Egyptian throne since the late 4th century before Christ. Symbolically, Cleopatra's suicide also represents the ultimate act of affirmation by a queen, aware of the significance of her choices. Rather than resign herself to an unworthy captivity, she leaves to posterity the image of a resolute sovereign, master of her destiny until the end. Ancient chroniclers, such as Plutarch, emphasize the tragic and grandiose dimension of this end. In the eyes of the Roman people, and then subsequent generations, Cleopatra becomes the queen who chose to die rather than live dishonored. This gesture definitively seals her myth, nurturing over the centuries various interpretations, sometimes admiring, sometimes tinged with prejudices. With her disappears the last great regent of independent Egypt. Cleopatra's death raises delicate questions of succession for Egypt. The queen's eldest son, Ptolemy XIV, nicknamed Caesarion, is recognized by her as the child of Julius Caesar. About 17 years old at his mother's passing, he is the last hope to perpetuate the royal lineage. However, Octavian sees in him a potential threat to his power, for Caesarion could claim Caesar's legacy and thus contest Octavian's legitimacy at the head of Rome. Determined to let no rival consolidate a future power base, Octavian has the young sovereign captured. Under a pretext difficult to verify, it is said that advisors suggested to him, "There cannot be two Caesars." Octavian orders his execution. Thus ends the direct descendant of Julius Caesar, putting a final point to the political heritage of Cleopatra and Caesar. As for the other three children Cleopatra had with Mark Antony, they experience a less grim fate, though they are deprived of their mother and all power. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, along with their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus, are spared by Octavian. According to tradition reported by some ancient authors, these children are taken to Rome. They are entrusted to Octavia, the sister of Octavian, who was once the legitimate wife of Mark Antony before he began his liaison with Cleopatra. Octavia, endowed with keen political sense and eager to appear magnanimous, raises these children in a Roman environment, far from the Egyptian land they will likely never see again. The presence of these young heirs in Rome, although they hold no political power, serves Octavian's propaganda. He can thus boast of having not only triumphed over Mark Antony and Cleopatra, but also of ensuring the protection and education of their offspring. Some historians emphasize that this forced adoption demonstrates both Rome's desire to appropriate the symbolic authority of the conquered East and Octavian's interest in presenting himself as a lenient leader, ready to welcome the children of his defeated enemies into his home. The later history of these children remains uneven in terms of written records. It is known that Cleopatra Selene, the couple's only daughter, later marries the king of Mauritania, Juba II. This marriage, arranged by Augustus, the new name of Octavian once his powers were consolidated, is part of the policy of pacifying Roman provinces and their areas of influence. For Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, their fate remains more obscure. Some fragmentary accounts suggest that they also remained under Rome's vigilant control, without knowing precisely whether they ended their days in Italy or were placed in charge of client territories. In any case, they no longer play any major role in the politics of the Mediterranean basin. After the death of Cleopatra in 30s before Christ, Egypt ceased to be an independent kingdom and became a Roman province under the authority of Augustus. This change marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded 3 centuries earlier after the death of Alexander the Great, and inaugurated a period of direct domination by the Roman Empire. The administration of the region was entrusted to a prefect appointed by the emperor, rather than a senator, to avoid any personal ambition that could jeopardize the vital grain supply to Rome. Indeed, Egypt was quickly perceived as the breadbasket of the empire, annually providing significant amounts of cereals necessary for feeding the Roman populace. Roman control also manifested through economic and fiscal reforms. Taxes were collected rigorously, and the Roman state closely controlled the lands, agricultural operations, and commercial activities around the Nile. The port of Alexandria, already flourishing under the Ptolemies, remained a major maritime hub, feeding into a vast network of exchanges. However, the region's prosperity was now primarily exploited for the benefit of Rome, reinforcing the financial power of the emperor. On a cultural level, the arrival of the Romans led to significant changes. Some Egyptian temples continued to function, and traditional cults persisted under the doctrinaire watch of the new masters, who were mostly interested in the stability of the province. Artistic and religious exchanges appeared through syncretism. Egyptian deities were adopted and transformed within the Greco-Roman pantheon, while Greco-Roman influences seeped into the local culture. The Greek elites, who had been established in Egypt since the Ptolemies, adapted quite well to this new regime, as many already maintained diplomatic or commercial ties with influential Roman families. The Romanization of Egypt also translated into constructions and urban developments. New statues bearing the image of the emperor adorned Alexandria, while numerous public buildings, such as gymnasiums, forums, and baths, reflected Roman power. The administrative structures took inspiration from the imperial model, with a bureaucratic hierarchy responsible for managing taxation and maintaining peace. Nevertheless, Egyptian uniqueness, with its millennia-old religious traditions, persisted in the countryside and among the groups most attached to ancestral rites. This coexistence between the pharaonic heritage and Roman oversight shaped the province's identity in the long term. For Rome, seizing Egypt represented both a massive economic advantage and a symbol of power. Holding the territory once ruled by Cleopatra, the last great Hellenistic sovereign, allowed Augustus to consolidate his image as a victor and benefactor of the Roman people. The agricultural resources, strategic position on the Mediterranean Sea, and the legendary aura of Egyptian civilization provided the Roman Empire with unmatched prestige. Over the decades, this domination became deeply ingrained in the collective mindset, and subsequent generations came to view Egypt as an indispensable pillar of the imperial economy. In the centuries following the Roman conquest, Cleopatra continued to spark interest in art and culture. In late antiquity, her image appeared on coins, frescoes, and even reliefs, often associated with tales of her reputed charm and tragic defeat. During the Renaissance, Europe rediscovered ancient authors, and the story of the supposedly fatal queen re-emerged in painting and literature. Her character became a source of inspiration for artists who, influenced by ancient texts, emphasized her love affair with Mark Antony and her spectacular death. One of the notable examples of Cleopatra's place in later culture is found in the play Antony and Cleopatra by William Shakespeare, written at the very beginning of the 17th century. The English playwright portrays Cleopatra as passionate, sometimes capricious, symbolizing the sensual East. In this portrayal, she embodies both the femme fatale and the sovereign capable of wielding diplomacy. This ambivalence reflects the interest her figure evokes, at times a courageous queen, at times a dangerous seductress. Over time, the legend solidifies. The allure of ancient narratives, the exotism associated with Egypt, and the fascination with Roman power fuel numerous creations, whether in painting, like the Italian painter Tiepolo, or among neoclassical artists, or in literature. Even before modern times, representations of Cleopatra's death, often dramatized by the bite of a snake, proliferate to illustrate the brilliance and fall of a queen, conquered by the virile strength of Rome. This iconography helps to forge a Manichaean narrative, where the queen is reduced to a symbol of voluptuousness and perfidy. Yet, some scholars progressively refine their analysis, trying to understand the real stakes of Cleopatra's government and her role as a guardian of pharaonic traditions. This imagery has constantly evolved over the eras. In the 19th century, Egyptologists reveal more concrete aspects of Egyptian civilization, sparking a renewed interest in the country's last sovereign. Archaeological excavations, the discovery of papyri, and the translation of hieroglyphs do not dissipate the romantic aura surrounding the queen. On the contrary, they enrich it with factual details, contributing to the creation of new artistic interpretations. Over time, Cleopatra becomes both a historical figure and a myth, shaped by the Western fascination with Eastern power and the drama of decline. The combination of ancient stories, plays, paintings, and later cinematic productions has resulted in building an almost timeless image of the queen. Cleopatra is perceived as a woman of unrivaled beauty, capable of captivating the most powerful men in the world. This reputation results from a carefully maintained myth, where emphasis is placed on her physical appearance, even though many historical clues highlight her erudition and political skills. Ancient texts, whether favorable or hostile, have greatly contributed to constructing the legend of a seductive and sometimes manipulative Cleopatra. The physical descriptions of the queen, blending praises and criticisms, often come from less direct sources than the propaganda spread by Octavian. He saw in the demonization of Cleopatra a means to rally the Roman people to his cause against Mark Antony. According to some accounts, such as that of Dio Cassius, Cleopatra's beauty was enhanced by her grace and intelligence, while others emphasize her charisma. In numismatic portraits, coins issued during her reign, the queen appears with sometimes unflattering features, possibly to assert royal authority rather than to seduce. Beyond the question of her real appearance, Roman propaganda amplified narratives describing her as dangerously enchanting, ready to use lies or potions to achieve her goals. In the writings of historians, poets, and moralists, Cleopatra is depicted as the antithesis of Roman virtue. This contrast, powerfully exploited in stories, has long overshadowed the political or administrative dimension of her reign, making her a sort of Oriental siren. The reputation of being one of the most beautiful women of all time owes more to her charisma, in the broad sense, than to objectively established aesthetic standards. Cleopatra likely possessed a keen sense of negotiation and presentation. Sources highlight her ability to present herself spectacularly during her diplomatic meetings, for example with Caesar or Mark Antony, to impress with her presence. Her mastery of languages, encyclopedic knowledge, and ease in navigating through Greco-Roman and Egyptian cultural codes also fed the legend. This power of seduction, not limited to the romantic realm, translated into real political authority. Surrounding herself with competent advisors, Cleopatra watched over her kingdom's development, trying to balance debts and alliances. Her charm was thus an asset in service of a thoughtful strategy. This duality, scholarly woman and skilled politician on one hand, queen associated with luxury and passion on the other, produced an effect of flattery and fascination among some of her contemporaries. In a Mediterranean world dominated by male power, the emergence of such an influential female figure inspired as much admiration as fear. After the fall of the Roman Empire, medieval Western society did not completely forget Cleopatra, although she was perceived more through a moralistic lens. It was during the Renaissance, and especially during the classical and romantic periods, that her figure resurged in the collective imagination. Scholars, poets, and painters became fascinated with antiquity, and Cleopatra regularly appeared in plays and monumental paintings, embodying the decadent splendor of the East opposed to Western rigor. In 20th century Hollywood cinema, the peak of this myth was realized notably with the film Cleopatra in 1963, in which the queen was portrayed by Elizabeth Taylor. Her sumptuous appearance, lavish costumes, and the staging of her love story with Mark Antony left a deep impression on the public. This production, one of the most expensive of its time, popularized the image of a queen with supernatural beauty, further accentuating the belief that she epitomized the most desirable woman of all time.